Hey y'all, welcome to our video of Dr. McGoldrick, Monica McGoldrick, uh, discussing and demonstrating her use of genograms in a first session with a real client. You will see prior to the session a brief interview with Dr. McGoldrick and Victor Yalom. And then you'll see the session where she uses the genogram, and then you'll see a debrief afterward with Dr. Yalom. As you are watching the video, please pay attention to the following things. So notice the nonverbal messages and responses between the client and the therapist. This gets at sort of the evidence and the manifestations of the transference, countertransference dynamics at play in family therapy. Notice that John, the client, demonstrates some resistance, just to give you examples of things to prepare for, even as you are interviewing your own family members for your own project. Notice anything in John's responses that A, resonates with you, and or B, you expect to experience during your interviews with your family members. Notice how John articulates some multicultural issues in his family, racism, sexism, etc. I'm looking for some of these things, as I've mentioned before, looking for some of these aspects of your awareness in your own genogram projects. Notice who was cut off in John's family and how did the family members of John's generation deal with this or these cutoffs. Notice the power of the here and now. The implicit becomes explicit, and John can now take his next developmental steps. And then watch the discussion at the end. This is a master reviewing the work that they have done and providing answers to questions that you might have. For example, why do we ask students to learn genogramming with their own family? And also, what if I don't have much information to provide in my project? Dr. McGoldrick gets at these two common and important questions, as well as others. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. McGoldrick. And I hope you enjoy what you see and learn.
I'm Victor Yalom, and I'm pleased to be here today with Monica McGoldrick. She's one of the leading experts in family therapy, well known for her work on the family life cycle, culture, and the use of genograms.
Hi.
Welcome, Monica.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in a little bit, we're going to have a chance to see you do a demonstration with a client, showing how you use genograms in therapy. But before we get to that, I thought we'd cover some of the basics. First of all, may sound simple, but what is a genogram?
Okay, truthfully, a genogram is just a fancy word for a family tree. It's just a map of who you belong to, who you come from in terms of your biological and legal family of origin, but also your friends, your pets, the people you work with who are important in your life. And a genogram is just a way of mapping those relationships, putting those people out there, and to a limited extent, conveying who are you close to, who are you cut off from, with whom do you have conflicts, and so forth, so that you can make sense of where a person is at with the people that they belong to.
Yeah, you've used that word a couple times, belong to. That's really key for you.
It is.
How so?
Uh, I think it's something about the meaning of home, of who we are as human beings, that none of us ever goes anywhere alone. We take with us people who live in our hearts. We take with us the wounds of people we have lost or not been able to work things out with. And I think that all matters in terms of how we then think about ourselves and our lives when we get stuck.
Yeah, certainly in this society in the United States, perhaps the most individualistic society in the world, that belies some of the common ideas we have about the lone, the cowboy, the pioneer, that we're individuals.
And a whole lot of psychotherapy is done from an extremely individual perspective, as if people were alone in the universe, able to just work out their relationships with each other and with themselves and deal with their anxieties and depression. And I just think that's a false idea.
Why?
That because none of us is alone in the universe. And it's extremely important who we carry in our hearts. And it's important for us as clinicians to remind people who they belong to and who matters to them in order to help them make the best decisions they can for their lives, which is what I think our job is at the end of the day, to help people make the best decisions about what do they want to do next.
And how does that help them make best decisions? Reminding them, grounding them in who they belong to.
Well, if you think you're completely alone, then you have sort of no field of vision about kind of what's the context in which you would be making a particular decision or another. If I get it, that I am here because my grandmother loved me and struggled for me and wanted me to do something important in life, then I might be much better able to take the struggle I'm now having with my child or my sibling and say, what would my grandmother want me to do now? And then bring that into who I'm trying to be.
Because those are
important relationships.
And they've shaped us in many
and they
ways.
Continue to shape us. I mean, the people who have loved us, even when they're gone, live in our hearts. And if I truly believe if we can be reminded of who we belong to, it gives us better energy to think, well, okay, so what do I want to do now?
And it certainly, for the therapist, it helps give you that in a very quick, economical way.
Enormously.
Yeah.
And the genogram is just a map of all those important people that we can then draw on and help people draw on.
But as we'll see in this nice demonstration, the act of creating that map, filling it in, quickly gets you thinking systemically and the clients thinking systemically.
Right.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yes.
So a couple things strike me as I watch this, and the viewers will have a chance to see it in a few minutes. But you spend a lot of time in the first session with this client, John Freeman. He's a 39-year-old African-American graphic designer, as I understand.
Yes.
And this is a reenactment?
Yes, it's a reenactment of an actual therapy case. Some details have been modified.
Okay.
Too.
So you spend a lot of time in this session constructing a rather full genogram. I'm sure things can be added later if you continue to see him. And as we'll see, he's resistant at times, a little defensive, wondering why you spend so much time, asking about his grandfather or grandmother, things like that. Is that common that clients might be wondering that?
I would say yes. It's very common for people to wonder why do you want to know about all these people?
Yeah, I mean, it comes to mind kind of the kind of stereotype of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, finding all about, and it's all being tracked back to what your mother did to you. But
this has a very different purpose.
Okay, so tell me.
Because that traditional psychodynamic model was looking for I'm oversimplifying, I think only slightly, looking for the villain. And the villain was usually your mother and what she did wrong before you were 5 or something.
Mm-hmm. And focusing on psychopathology.
Yes, always looking for what made you dysfunctional. What created this problem, what bad thing or bad person. This is a completely different idea, because it's about where do we get our strengths and our resources, and that becomes our best tool, I believe, as clinicians, that we have and can draw from all the people who our client has known, cared about, learned from, and struggled with in their lives. So we can say, maybe you weren't able to do it there, but maybe you could do it here.
Yeah, we'll see in this video how you focus a lot initially on trying to understand some of the patterns that might have contributed to his presenting problem, which is around his marriage and his withdrawal from it, but also strengths from some male role models. Yeah.
But I do think that the mapping of the context of looking at, how did you get here? Of course, it is a life cycle issue. And in John's case, he's at a point in an early phase of the life cycle where, sort of what's happened to him up until now is very important, but also how does he see himself going forward? Now he's just about to have a child. How does he see that moving forward? And for that, looking at on his genogram what happened in his life is extremely relevant in helping him think about what are the choices he wants to make now, as I see it.
So this is for many of our viewers, this is a very different way of working. I mean, people have so many agendas to cover in a first session. I mean, if you're working at some agency or something, you might be expected to get an intake, which is not just going to cover family background, but mental status exam and your symptoms and all sorts of things, and a treatment plan. What are you going to do? And some the newer approaches, very empirically validated, having a lot of structure to it. And I'm wondering, how do you fit this in? What's your advice to people? How do you learn to do this?
My argument would be that we look much too much for the pathology in isolation from the whole human being, and we don't look nearly enough at the sources of resilience and at who people are as whole people, and people in a cultural context, people in a geographic context, people in a family and social context, that are those people are stressors here and there, but they're also resources. And to me, if we don't understand the context in which people live and only look for the pathology, which it's true, that's what we're supposed to be doing in the first session, I think it makes it very difficult to really connect with people.
Yeah.
Because I also think we're then re-stigmatizing them by saying, and so what else is wrong? And tell me about this. And, what about that limitation? Do you have any limitations over on the other side? And we haven't said at all, who loved you? Who matters to you? Why would you want to solve this problem?
Yeah. So we'll see you're working on your computer with the Genogram software to construct it. How do you manage to do that and to stay connected and build an alliance with a client?
Okay, well, first of all, I think, and that's a really good question, because there is a way in which, in order to get the larger picture, it takes you away from the immediate connection in the short run.
Mhm.
But I also think you're helping the client to build more of a sense of who they really are in terms of the people they belong to. So that in the long run, I hope this gets conveyed, it's certainly what I mean to do, is to relate to them through my paying attention to tell me about your brother and where is your brother in terms of your need right now, and where is your mother in terms of what you're going through, and try to make sense of what they're struggling with in terms of who else matters to them.
Mhm. Well, I think what does get conveyed is you have a deep interest in knowing him, and that's for you a critical way of knowing him is knowing who he's part of, where he's from, where he's going.
I believe that.
Yeah.
Just even using people's names,
Uh-huh.
to say your Uncle Mac, your Uncle Raymond, your Aunt Mamie,
Uh-huh.
whoever it is. I think that makes a big difference.
Uh-huh.
That when we see a person and go through an entire inquiry about what they're struggling with and never find out their brothers or sisters' names,
Uh-huh.
that's strange to me.
Yeah. All right. So, what should the viewers be watching for, listening for, as we see this session?
Well, obviously, this question of why am I trying to put so much context around it, and how does John respond to that? To pay attention to the resistances, because I'm sure the viewers would and will have those struggles themselves in such an inquiry. But particularly looking at what's their first thought, and then how does their hypothesizing about the situation change as they hear more about who John belongs to.
Mhm.
And are there questions that they then begin to think about their own families?
Hmm.
Because I think understanding your own family is very much a part of coming to realize why any of this actually matters.
All right.
With
Or one other detail. So
Yes.
you're seeing him individually.
Yes, which
Uh,
wouldn't in general be my preference, although for me family therapy is a way of thinking. It's not about who's in the room.
Huh.
So to me this is family therapy as I practice it all the time,
All right.
seeing a person alone. But I would have in general rather seen him with his wife, but he saw it as his issue, so I went with that. And
So he requested an
he
individual
requested
meeting.
it, and I figured, why not? That's fine. But I would, in the long run, want to, of course, meet the wife
Okay.
and see what her story is too.
All right. So let's take a look at the session, and you've added some commentaries throughout, further explaining kind of what you're thinking, what you're doing, and then you and I will meet after the session to continue this discussion.
Great. I'm very happy to meet you.
Hi.
And if it's okay with you, I'm going to take notes on my computer. Is that all right?
Yeah, I guess so.
I find it saves time and helps me organize things. Is that
Sure.
okay?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
So, but why don't you tell me a little bit why you're here, and then maybe we'll work backwards and kind of look at the larger picture. Is that
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Well, I came to see you because I'm having a little difficulty right now. I'm having difficulty with my wife, but I don't really think it's about her. I think it's probably a little bit about me. And I guess it's we've been married for about 2 years now, and you know, it's been great. It's been really good. And I mean, I wasn't sure I was going to get married. I was ever going to get married actually, but
Really?
I ended up finding someone. Yeah, and
Mhm.
so going from not thinking that to actually finding someone has been great, and the relationship has been going great. But I think I we've been having problems because I've been pulling away a little bit. Um, I guess there are times like I go out with friends and I don't call her to tell her that I'm going out or that I'm going to be staying out late.
Hmm.
And sometimes I stay out really late, so it's not like a 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock come home. It's like I come home the next day, like if it's on the
Wow.
weekend, Friday.
Now, you've been doing this ever since you got together with her, or?
No, actually not. Maybe I don't know, about 10 months after we got married. That's when it started. I can remember one time I was just feeling. I got off the phone with her, and I was just feeling a little. I don't know. I was feeling a little pent up, I think,
Mhm.
and I just decided to go, to a bar nearby and have a beer. And I just started sitting and talking with people. Before I knew it, it was like midnight, and I didn't call her, and I think she assumed I was coming home. So it's not like I do it all the time. It's just that I do it, and I don't call her, and then she gets upset, and then she asks me what was I doing or how come I didn't tell her.
Where do you go?
I mean, sometimes, I mean, like I said, I go hang out with some of my buddies. You know, they were the guys I hung out with before I was married.
Hmm.
Sometimes I stay at work, and I just sort of get more work done.
But when you don't come home the whole night,
Oh yeah, usually I'm hanging out with them, and we go out to a bar. Or we sort of go back to one of their houses. And
then you just sort of crash.
yeah, just
Uh-huh.
that's what we used to do. You
Hmm.
know, before I got married, but it was on weekends, so
Mhm.
sort of a little bit of the same thing. And that's not so much of an issue, I think. Then it is the fact that I'm pulling away,
Really?
and I don't really understand why I'm pulling away. And I'm also not really sort of respecting her in the relationship because I'm not letting her know what I'm doing or what I'm going to do. It's just hard for me to bring myself to call her and talk to her.
Hmm. So you just sort of get having a few drinks and then you think about calling, but
I just don't.
you just don't.
Mm.
How do you feel about her overall? I mean, how are you feeling about the relationship?
I love her. I love her a great deal.
Do you?
Yeah, I do. I really do. Um, I feel really close to her, and I feel like she is the one,
Hmm.
and she's the closest person. The person I've been the closest to, I think. And
So there's nothing about another woman or feeling like maybe I settled too soon or
I mean,
anything.
settled too soon. I'm 39, so
Okay.
settling too soon. So it's not that. I mean, I think sometimes I have that. Was this the right one, or maybe the better one is coming around the corner? Maybe. But that's normal. I think that's normal
You've
male
seen
stuff.
it. Uh-huh. Really?
Yeah, it's just sometimes. Sometimes I just pull away. You know.
Hmm.
I
Have
feel-
you and have you and she are you thinking about having kids and
Yeah, we are actually. She's pregnant.
oh wow.
Yeah.
This information surprised me because it appears to coincide with John's pulling back from his wife. Though until I happened to ask about it, he gave no indication that they were having a baby. Often, surprise revelations like this indicate issues around which a person has developed particular anxiety. How pregnant?
Um, she's 6. She's actually 6 months now.
Really?
Mhm.
So, do you know if it's going to be a boy or a girl?
That's gonna be a girl.
Really?
Mhm.
So, is that an issue
Well, I think it does make me a
concerned
little
about that?
stressed because I've never had to take care of kids. So even though I'm one of 5 kids,
Which one are you?
I'm the first boy, I'm the fourth of 5.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, even though I've seen kids be raised, and my mother had to deal with 5, one shouldn't be that tough. So, but
Hmm.
still, that sort of gets me a little bit sometimes, kind of weirds me out.
Hmm.
But yeah, I never thought I would have kids either. Well,
Really?
at least I wanted to have kids. And now I have the opportunity to, or at least I'm looking forward.
What are you thinking?
I was just thinking about, I mean, I am looking forward to it, but I think it just sort of, it stresses me out a little bit, or it scares me a
Mhm.
little. Yeah, it's a pretty big thing. So,
In what sense?
um, well, your life is not about you anymore.
Hmm.
It's about, raising a child, focus, kind of shifts a little bit. It's like
Mhm.
your responsibilities change, your life becomes a little bit more restricted.
John now fills in information about his family, and I can put together the details of his family members. Generally speaking, it's always helpful to get basic family information as far back as grandparents to be sure there is not a major problem or secret among the key relatives which is organizing the family. Do your siblings have kids?
Mm, yeah, my sisters do. I have a younger brother. He's
Uh huh.
yeah, he's 37. I have 3 older sisters, each of whom have 1 child. So yeah, I have 2 nephews and 1 niece.
So your oldest sister, what's her name?
Her name is Carol.
Uh huh. And how old is she?
She's 57.
So she was born in 1950 or so.
Yeah,
And she has a son.
yeah. She has a son who is uh, I think he's about 10 years younger than I am. So he's 29 now. His name's Jeffrey. Jeff.
Uh huh.
My middle sister, my second sister, her name is Denise, and she's 47, and she has a daughter, my niece Jessica, and Jessica is, I don't know, maybe she's 8, and I have a third sister who is 41, and her name is Gwen, and she has a son, Justin, who is, I guess, 15, 16, 16.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's me. Um, I'm 39, and I have a brother who's 37.
So you were born in.
I was born in 68.
Uh huh. And then your brother was born in 70.
Mhm.
And his name is.
It's Brad, but he doesn't have kids.
No.
No.
Does he have a girlfriend?
Mm, he tends to burn through them pretty quickly, but he has one now.
He has one most of the time.
He has one yeah, but he has difficulty staying with them for any long period of time. He's another one that didn't. I think he's even more strongly not going to get married than it is. I didn't think I would get married. I think he does not want to get married.
Really?
Yeah, he has a stronger sort of attitude towards that. I think I do.
So now tell me a little bit about your parents.
My father passed away. His name is Robert. He was born in 1929. So, and he died when I was 11.
So that was 19.
That was 1979.
Uh huh.
And my mother was born in 33. So she's like, I don't know, she's probably like 70, 74, 75.
Mhm.
Um,
And what's her name?
her name is Janny.
Uh-huh.
She's from the South, so her name is Janny Pearl.
So where does she live?
She currently lives in our family's home in South Jersey, Cherry Hill.
Oh, uh-huh. That's where you grew up?
hmm
Uh-huh.
So, and that's where at least my brother still lives. He doesn't live in the same house, but he lives in the same town.
Oh, does he? And your sisters are close by?
New York. All of
Uh-huh.
them live in New York.
Uh-huh. So your family stayed pretty close. You have one sister, Carol, and she's still married to
No.
her husband?
No. Her husband, his name is Ken,
Uh-huh.
and they've been divorced for quite some time.
Okay. But she never remarried?
No.
And how about Denise?
Denise, yeah, she's still married. His name is Gene. Their relationship is no, it's not so great. I don't know why they're still together. And my sister Gwen was married to Henry is his name, and they they're separated. They never went through with getting a divorce, but they separated pretty soon after Justin was born.
And what about your parents' marriage? How did they do?
I guess they did okay. They were together up until after my brother was born, maybe, I don't know, maybe 3 years, maybe 2, 3 years after my brother was born. Yeah, it was 72 when they separated. They never fully got divorced. They were just separated, but it didn't end on very good terms. So they didn't really talk to each other that much. They were civil to one another, but they lived very separate lives. But my father died when I was 11.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Because you had told me your father died in 79. So in 72, you were about 4.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
so do you remember them together?
I have little images of
Do
them
you?
together. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I remember my dad. Yeah, he's a pretty imposing guy. He was in the military. He was a Green Beret. I know that from stories, but I know that he was a Green Beret, but I remember him as a pretty imposing guy. So yeah, I have images of him, and I do remember him. I used to have bloody noses a lot when I was a kid, so he used to always do the thing where pinch the nose and tell you to hold your head back. I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Little things like that.
He lived around as you were growing up
Yeah.
until he died.
He lived in Washington D.C., so he really wasn't that far. And he did call to talk to us. So, and I saw him occasionally. So it wasn't like he was completely gone from our lives.
At this point, I'm wondering if John isn't minimizing the importance of his father's absence in his life. I'm thinking about his presenting problem of distancing from his wife just as he is about to become a father himself. I'm wondering if there could be a connection to his own father, and I decide to press more directly about his father. It doesn't sound like he was that much around. Am I right about that?
What do you mean that much around? Well, when they're separated, when he lives in a different state, it's kind of hard for him to be that much around.
My question seems to make him a bit defensive, and I try to explain the connection. Well, I'm just thinking that these days you're finding yourself staying out, not wanting to call your wife, and she is 6 months pregnant, so that may be more distressing to her even than at another time.
Yeah.
And what you're describing is really that your father was kind of gone from the time you were fairly young. So, I guess I was just wondering, is there sort of an anxiety about how am I going to do it? Because I didn't exactly have somebody there to show me.
Uh, I mean, my mother was there, and my
Mhm.
father was financially contributing to the house.
Mhm.
So, and he did call, and he was pretty responsible about keeping in touch with us.
Mhm.
He didn't come to see us a lot because my father worked a lot. He was,
What did he do?
he owned his own accounting business, so he
Hmm.
just, he was kind of a workaholic.
Mhm.
So he was constantly working. So I do remember that because, I didn't see him that much when I was younger. So the images I do have of him are pretty strong because I didn't see him that much. But he was a good provider, and
Hmm.
he worked a lot. Being a provider and being responsible, that's a pretty good role model, I guess.
John's reassurance again about his father having been a good role model makes me think I need to slow down in looking at contextual issues for his problem. When a client begins to resist exploration of family issues, I generally find it useful to go back to the presenting problem to keep that as the cornerstone for questions about background and context. I'm also feeling the need to validate how hard it is to talk to a stranger, especially across both gender and racial barriers, about deeply personal issues. And I want to be sure I stay connected to where he is in the conversation. I guess I'm just trying to see if I can understand anything from your overall background that might help to make sense of what you're struggling with now. Maybe let's go back to that issue and tell me a little bit more about sort of what's happening. What sense do you make of that?
You mean what's happening currently?
Yeah. I mean, what really made you want to come here?
I think what really makes, I think I don't seem to have any control over, like, I don't understand why I pull away.
Hmm.
And I know what I'm doing is not right. I know it. And I know it's not the responsible thing to do.
Hmm.
You know, my wife has made those comments about, her being 6 months pregnant. So,
Hmm.
she needs me even more now.
Hmm.
Despite the fact that I think, women can be a little crazy sometimes when the hormones are off balance, but that's just my own sort of spin on things. Well, but I you know, so I know that I should be there more, and I know
Mhm.
I should be a bit
Mhm.
more sort of, consistent in my behavior, but I just don't, and I am pretty responsible in my general life with work. I'm
Mhm.
that way with friends. I'm that way with my family, my siblings and my mom. I'm that way.
Mhm.
I've always been that way, but this is this is a different kind of thing, and
Mhm.
I don't really understand why it's happening. And I'm also afraid that it's gonna cause difficulties, well, more difficulties in my relationship, especially now that I'm starting my own family.
If you can't sort of find a way to stay present, you
Yeah.
mean?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
So now, at the same time, and I mean, you don't know me, so it's sort of hard to, just go right into the middle of things and say, tell me this and that about your personal life. And on the other hand, what you're talking about is about something that sort of goes to the heart of the matter when you're pulling away from your intimate relationship and you don't want to be doing it, you know
Hmm.
but I'm having the sense that just in asking you a few questions about your family that you don't really want to talk about it that much.
I don't really want to talk about what, my family, or
Yeah. I mean,
I mean, I guess I'm trying to figure out why talking about my family is relevant to my own problem, because it
uh-huh,
sort of feels like it's my problem. It's not their problem.
uh-huh,
It's not like I do this to them. So,
While previously John had seemed very defensive about his father, he is now being direct in questioning the relevance of talking about his family. This directness feels very different to me. It suggests that he is now ready to explore issues. He's telling me outright he doesn't see the connection. So I must clarify why I think it may be relevant to explore background and context. My sense is that a lot of times, especially the kinds of things you're talking about, of where you suddenly find yourself doing something that's a behavior that doesn't seem like how you want to be, or whatever, that sometimes, some other larger things related to where we come from may affect that. And that's sort of why I start with a focus on what's about your siblings, tell me about your parents, those kinds of questions. To see if, did your father ever do that? Did your mother ever do that? Do you know if anybody else might have had anxiety about having a kid? So to me, those questions are good ways to try to make sense of why might you be going through this now. Does that make sense?
it makes sense. It's a possibility, I guess.
Uh-huh. Doesn't make you really
I don't know.
feel so enthusiastic to talk about it, though. Maybe.
I-
Listen, this
I
is
guess,
hard. I'm not meaning to give you a hard time, but that
I
seems
feel
like
better.
it's distressing you.
Well, I guess I'd feel better if there was a specific question that you were asking, because it is kind of hard to talk in general too. So if there was
Mhm.
something, specific, like, I don't know,
Well,
what's my relationship like with my brother or something, or how do you feel about him, or just something. But the general question, it just makes me feel a little, I don't know, a little uncomfortable, I guess.
okay, I hear you. Um, well, I am interested in your relationship with your brother, but maybe what if we start with your parents?
Okay.
Um, you didn't get to know your father for too long, but what sort of relationship did you have with him?
I guess it was a pretty good, for however long it was. It was pretty good.
Yeah.
We had good conversations on the phone, and I really looked forward to seeing him when he came up to visit. He came up to visit a couple of times around the holidays, so around Christmas. It was
Mhm.
always nice to get gifts and stuff like that. Yeah, and from what I understand, my father was I think for me, he was there, and I definitely felt close to him because he was my dad. I also think, there was my father. My father had my father had a heart attack um, uh, about a couple of weeks before I was born. About
Really?
2 weeks, yeah. And
This news that his father had a heart attack so close to his birth astonishes me. No wonder he's been anxious. Now his disappearing begins to make sense. I find it extremely common for people to miss such key emotional triggers. 2 weeks, whoa, that must have been something.
well, it was for my mom.
I can
I
imagine.
guess, me, I didn't know, right?
Wow,
But
wow,
yeah, that kind of scared her. That scared her a great deal,
my God, yeah.
and she was very close to term, and so
Mm.
I think it was hard for my family in general at that point. Um,
Wow.
but he was okay. Um, he eventually, there wasn't any long term damage or anything. It wasn't a stroke, thank goodness. It's just a minor heart attack. But I think that sort of scared him a little, scared him a lot. Um, And he had a very different attitude towards, I was somebody who was special because I think he felt that he may not have been around to see me. There's the possibility. So,
often the whole family has participated in keeping awareness of the emotional impact of such nodal events out of consciousness. So it's not really surprising that John brings it up in a kind of, oh, by the way fashion. You never know where asking people about their families may lead, or when something significant may come out almost without awareness. This is at least the third time so far that John has revealed something very surprising in a casual way. First, when he mentioned staying out all night without calling his wife. Second, when he mentioned that his wife was 6 months pregnant. And now, as he tells of his father's heart attack just before he was born. The suddenness and casualness of these revelations may be important to making sense of the story, because perhaps they reveal aspects of people's experience that they themselves have not really integrated into their own narrative.
Yeah.
Wow. Have you ever been scared that the same thing might happen to you now that you're having a child?
Yeah, I never thought about that.
No.
No, I never thought. I mean, maybe, I don't, maybe I thought about it.
How old was your father?
I don't know. It was what? It was negative 2
He
months,
was
negative
born
2
in
weeks.
68 and he was
So-
born in 29. So he would have been like, oh my God, he would have been your very age now, what you are now.
No, you're kidding.
I'm not kidding.
He would have been
29 to
39.
68. He would have been 39. What is fascinating about the process of tracking a person's history through a genogram is how often these kinds of coincidences show up, again, so often at the margins of consciousness. That may be so significant in terms of people's sense of their own life cycle. Surely most of us think of our life trajectory at some time in relation to that of our same sex parent. And here is the scariest connection possible: his father's experience of life threat at the moment of his own birth and at his age. My first thought is that perhaps it's no wonder he at times wants to escape his own life course at this point, perhaps fearing he will follow in his father's footsteps. You never thought about that?
No, I never thought about that.
Wow. What did you hear about? What happened when he had the heart attack?
Well, I know that it freaked my mother out. It stressed her out a great deal, and they were concerned that it might induce labor. And my mother was, she didn't want to lose him, of course, and it sort of changed the mood of my birth because my sisters were also afraid.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it affected my mother a great deal.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. I think I hear that their relationship changed after that, after I was born.
Really?
Yeah.
How do you mean?
I think, well, my parents were a little closer, I think. So she was a little bit guarded after that, a little bit fearful. She became much more safety conscious of the kids and of me. I think my father started working a lot more after that.
Why do you think? You think he was worried that he might not live too long? Or?
I don't know. Maybe he just had work he needed to do.
Maybe. And then they had your brother, and your father was in okay health.
Yeah, he was in okay health. He started taking care of himself a little better at that point. I mean, that's what I hear. Um,
So what happened that they separated then? Now I want to track back what happened after his birth to help him see his family's life cycle trajectory and develop more clarity to choose the course he wants to follow, rather than being driven forward by events and feelings out of consciousness.
I just think they grew apart. They just kind of grew apart, and after my brother was born.
But they've been together for so many years because, right? Your sister, she was almost 18 years older than you, right?
Mhm.
So they'd been together for more than 20 years.
Well, yes and no. They've been together for a long time, but my oldest sister is not his child, and Carol. And I think they got married when Carol was, I don't know, like 7 or 8. So, they've been together for however many years his sister's age. So they've been together for a while, but not since.
I see. Not since.
Yeah, Carol's not his daughter.
I see. So who was her father?
Why is that important?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying it to pry, but just to sort of try to understand about how the marriages worked in the family and what happened to that person. Does that seem like a strange question?
It kind of makes me a little uncomfortable. I mean, because I don't really see how, I don't really see how that's all that relevant.
Somehow, I seem to have stumbled into something that is secret or private. Even though John has been talking about quite personal things prior to this, he suddenly does not want to mention something which, on the surface, seems insignificant. The issue is that when we're asking people to tell their story, we never know when a small question may lead to something very difficult to deal with, an issue of shame, trauma, or family secrecy. And we must be prepared for this possibility. I don't know how you were referred here.
He's a client of yours, and had very good things to say about you.
Okay, but even so, you don't know me. And so I could see that my asking you a bunch of questions might seem like, well, what's it to her? But my view is that a lot of things in our lives may be connected in ways that we don't always know. So I can't help thinking that as you're trying to figure out how do I love my wife in the way I want to and support her as she's having a kid, and you tell me this very traumatic thing about your father, I can't help thinking that possibly who else your mother loved or was connected to could be a part of her story, and she's your mother, so that maybe could matter. You know what I mean? I don't know that, but to me, that's why, to sort of get a sense of who do you belong to and who came, who left, who was close.
I mean, I understand what you're saying. I think probably what's hard for me is that, I don't know you. But I feel like everything's fair game because you never know where things might lead. But, with my family, there's sort of like certain things you just don't talk about. Or, you just don't divulge or share very easily. So,
is there something about Carol's dad that, I don't know, might be problematic to talk about or something? I mean, I'm not asking you to talk about something you're not comfortable with, you know? I'm just trying to help you understand where you're feeling stuck, and I don't know.
Well, the weird thing is that, I mean, you ask me if you don't want to talk about something that I'm uncomfortable with. You know, I don't necessarily think I'm uncomfortable with it. I just think that maybe my mother's uncomfortable with it.
Hmm.
And so we just don't talk about it. We don't even talk about it amongst ourselves, though we all know it.
Really?
Yeah.
But I was just going to say that a lot of times we maybe pick up through our sense of loyalty to our families rules that we don't even know where they come from, just as maybe we pick up anxieties that we don't even know where they come from. And that, sometimes they act in the weirdest way. So, I mean, you have seemed reluctant a number of times in our conversation here. But sort of like at some level, I could see why you'd be, what's it to you about who Carol's father is? And on the other hand, we are trying to understand.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I really don't care. I mean, for me, she's my sister, so I don't really care. But my mother has always had this blanket policy of uh, of withdrawal, or the policy of just not talking about things, of withholding, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Hmm.
And so we aren't allowed to talk about some things. Now, of course, kids talk, so I know stories from my sisters and from other relatives. And anyway, Carol, my mother was very young when she had Carol, and Carol wasn't expected, if you know what I mean. Yeah. My mother grew up in a small town in the South.
Hmm.
She had this relationship, which was kind of a relationship that, it wasn't necessarily sanctioned at that time, because, race relations being what they were.
Guy was white.
Yeah.
I see.
And as far as my grandmother knew and was concerned, I didn't hear this from her, but I heard it from Denise. I heard it from an aunt. You know how stories go. So my mother really liked the guy, and he really liked her. But it was one of those things that couldn't work. And then my mother got pregnant, and that caused a huge issue in that town.
Really? The guy was known or something?
He was fairly, yeah, he was, or his father was at least.
So what happened?
I think that from what I hear, they were no longer able to see each other, and his family renounced any involvement. And I think it was kind of tough on my mom, because she was like 16, 17. And she ended up having a child, and, she was still living with my grandmother and her grandmother, my great grandmother. At that point, they were all living in you know how small towns are in the South back in those days. And it was weird, because from what I understand, it was a source of shame for a while, because she was so young, having a child out of wedlock. And particularly one that, there was no sort of support from the side of the family. But also, Carol was biracial, so there was also, a little bit of she was a special child, kind of. So it was this weird sort of thing. But I think it had an impact on my family's reputation on my mom's side. And my mom's side of the family is pretty proud. So I think, I think ultimately that may have caused them to leave the town.
Wow, I'm
My
sorry.
grandmother left first. Well, back in those days, it is what it is. Like I tell you, it's not that I necessarily feel uncomfortable with it because
Yeah.
my sister's my sister, but you know,
No, but just,
we don't
you know,
talk
that
about
your
these
mother
things.
had to go through all of that and not get the support that she deserved and, you know,
Yeah.
have to experience all the racism that went with people's reactions of all that.
Well, there were
It's-
different times. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm sure it was very, very tough.
yeah.
But, my family has loved Carol. I mean, there's no reason not to.
Hmm.
And I don't really think that she's got worse off for it. I mean, I think she's, she can be a little bit strange sometimes because because she's not like the rest of us in terms of we all look very much like my father.
Do you?
Yeah, and so she doesn't. I mean, there's
Uh-huh.
sort of a difference also in skin complexion. So
Hmm.
we're all sort of like medium or dark brown, and then she's sort of, of a lighter
Mhm.
complexion. So we always make fun of her because of that.
Yeah.
We used to joke around about
Uh-huh.
that. So I know she feels a little left out sometimes
Uh-huh.
because of that, but also there's this sort of sense of, you know, things have some things have been easier for her as a result of that too,
Yeah.
if you understand what I'm saying.
Mm.
Life sometimes is easier to negotiate if you have a lighter complexion. So I think that's been a little easier for her in that regard. So she's kind of got this weird sort of space.
Has that created sort of a distance among you all as siblings or not really?
I don't know, not a distance. I think there are points where we don't understand each other
Really?
or where she doesn't understand us because,
Is there sort of a sense that the others, if you are kind of a clump and I mean, she is 10 years, 10 years older, right, than Denise?
yeah, she is. She's much older. I think there's a difference because of age.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely she was pretty much on her own by the time I came into the picture.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really live with her.
Mm-hmm.
And my brother, he certainly didn't live with her. So there's that difference. But no, I think we all sort of,
Have a pretty strong
we all
family feeling.
congeal pretty well.
Uh-huh.
Mhm. And there wasn't really any clumping between my us and my sister Carol.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the clumping, well, if you can call it clumping, or maybe just we tend to gravitate towards each other. There was my sisters on this side. There were my sisters, and there were my brother and myself on this side. We always sort of perceive them as slightly different. I mean,
Really?
they're girls, but
Uh-huh.
it's all. Well, they were older.
Mm-hmm.
They got married. They started a family sort of thing, and they're kind of, I don't know. My brother and I always had this sort of feeling like we would never want to marry any of our sisters.
Really?
Yeah, I guess most.
Why?
I guess most guys look at their sisters and probably say the same thing.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think it's also because um, they just seem to have. Family just seems to. I, how can I say this? There just seems to be a different attitude towards men and relationships, and I think it's not just my sisters. I think it's also. I think it's my mom, but it seems like it's my mom's side of the family too.
Hmm. Was she one of all sisters?
Yeah, she was third sister of four sisters, and
Was there some way in which that meant women were like really different? It was more.
I think women are kind of seen as special.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even they kind of rally around each other a little bit.
Hmm.
It's sort of important to keep the ranks, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of have this. I don't want to say it's like a fraternal thing, but it's for women. So but sorority doesn't quite get it. But it's
A
little bit-
sisterhood somehow.
yeah, it's a little bit of that.
I'm surprised, really, at how powerful gender appears to have been in John's sibling experience. More powerful, apparently, than skin color or distance in age in their relationships. It makes me want to explore more about how this may have been affected by extended family sibling experiences as well, to understand the fraternity sorority issues John is describing, and also to make sure what ramifications he thinks there are for himself gender wise.
Yeah, it's a little bit of that. My yeah, my brother and I think we feel that a little bit. Like they have their own sort of clique kind of thing. And they have their own way of thinking about things and just don't want to get mixed up in their stuff. And I think it does. My mom is a little bit like that, and her sisters are my aunts. It's like when my mother had Carol, there was this sort of rallying around. None of none of my aunts were married, and my grandmother actually wasn't married at that point. She and my grandfather John, they separated, but they lived in the same town. And interestingly, she forbade my aunts and my mom to see my grandfather.
Really?
Yeah, because they didn't end on the best of terms. So, and I think it might have involved him cheating or something.
Really?
Yeah. So my grandmother, and she didn't ever remarry or anything, but she forbade them from seeing each other. But yet, my mom and my aunts would always go to the other side of town where he lived, and they would see him. So they would talk to him regularly.
Really?
And yeah, I'd never met him, and but I heard this actually from my mom. And when he died, the girls got together and paid for and attended his funeral, and they didn't tell my grandmother.
Wow.
So
When did he die?
Time ago. I don't know. Maybe when he was like 40, 30, 40, 40, 45.
Really?
So it must have been like, I don't know, like in the mid 50s.
I see. So Carol had already been born.
I think, yes, definitely, yes. But they were all living in the same town still. So,
But that's really interesting that in spite of the separation and your grandmother forbidding them, they somehow maintained the relationship with him.
Yeah, my grandmother was pissed when she heard that they had attended the funeral because she didn't, and that they had actually paid for it.
This too is extremely interesting. Even though the maternal grandfather had left the family, he managed to stay connected to his daughters in spite of the grandmother's efforts to keep him out. I always find it fascinating when secrets actually connect family members in spite of overt cutoffs. Wow.
She's very upset with that.
Interesting.
But
now you're named for him, aren't you?
I am. Yeah.
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 You ever think about that? Like,
sometimes I do. Sometimes I think I have thought about it, and I say to myself, well, I wonder how he is or how he was. I think that's why my mom shared that story with me about her close relationship with him. She shared some other stories too. He was a very responsible person for them. He provided for them. He looked out for them. If there were issues with boys and stuff like that, he was very much on the scene too. But it was kind of hard to deal with when my mother got pregnant. I think that was a pretty big blow for him because he couldn't do anything about it. But yeah, I always wonder what I should be doing to sort of live up to or live into the name. Yeah, it's pretty good. It feels good to know you're named after somebody.
Interesting. Clearly, being named for his grandfather does have deep meaning for John. This spiritual connection could be relevant to underline for him as we go along.
But yeah, there's this for my aunts. my mother's sisters and my grandmother, there was this sort of this batten down the hatches kind of, it's really all about us, and we need to be pretty cohesive
I
for
see.
survival's
Mhm.
sake.
This kind of process of women bonding together for support is common, of course. But since he's a man, I want to make sure he'll have a place to fit in the family so he will not be extruded.
Seems like some of the major issues were around relationships with men.
So now let me ask you a question. It might seem odd, but I'm wondering soon you're going to have a daughter. And in one sense, you'll be outnumbered by the women in your family. You have thought about that? What do you think about
I think
that?
it makes it's made my mother at least very happy,
Has it?
because there's another woman coming into the family to continue the line kind
Uh-huh.
of deal. Um,
But do you think it's possible that at some level that sort of scares you that it could be, as you're saying, the women sort of get central and the men are pushed to the periphery, you know?
well, I think that's what happened with my father.
Yeah,
I think that's why my parents ended up splitting up.
really. How do you mean?
It wasn't like that before I was born. Their relationship was different, but I think when I was born, and my mother kind of changed. She became a little bit more cautious and
Hmm.
sort of, I don't know, if paranoid's the word, but
Sort of protective of
very
her
protective
kids, you
of
mean?
her kids.
Uh-huh.
And I think her focus her focus was less on him than it was on us.
Hmm.
And so I think they sort of drifted apart. My
Really?
father started working a lot more, and
Mm-hmm.
they were just leading pretty different lives. I think my brother was an attempt to hold things back together.
Really? It sort of didn't quite do it?
I think if I'm being honest, I think it made it worse.
Really? I can't help wondering now that he makes this connection if some of the brother's negativity about marriage may not be directly related to his place in the family's history. He was the child who was meant to bring the parents together, but instead drove them apart. Down the road, I wonder if it could be worth having a meeting with the two brothers to help them explore the impact of their family experiences on their attitudes about life, marriage, and gender.
Because there was another child to look out for.
Wow. Now, we haven't really talked about your father's family. How did these issues play out in his family? Did he have siblings?
My father was the only child.
Really?
Yeah. Um, it makes it sound as though like it's nothing but tragedy happening on both
Really?
sides.
Why? What happened in his family? This comment about nothing but tragedy reminds me that we need to keep seeking sources of resilience in John's family story. Unless I consciously attend to the resources and positives he could find thinking about his family's history depressing and want to push it away instead of appreciating the ways it can give him strength as he is about to create a new generation.
uh, my father's my grandmother
Mhm.
died giving birth to my father,
Really?
so he never knew her, and he was the only child.
So then, who did he grow up with?
And he grew up with my grandfather George
Mhm.
and my great grandmother.
And what was her name?
Her name was Jeanette.
Mm-hmm.
And he also grew up with my Uncle Mac, my grandfather's brother. But he was much younger than my grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
So he was more like my father's age, like maybe 10 years older. Yeah, Mac sort of in my father's life as like a brother, older brother,
Mm-hmm.
and mentor for my father for a long time. And their paths were pretty close. I mean, they went to the military.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And they had stories to tell about being in the army. And interestingly enough, at one point when my family, both sides, all lived in New York because they eventually lived in New York, that's where my parents met.
Really?
But not only did my parents meet there, but my Uncle Mac ended up marrying my mother's second sister, Pauline.
Really?
Yeah. So yeah, he's both my uncle and my great uncle at the same time.
Wow. That's interesting.
So he's been he was pretty important in my father's life, and actually he's until he died, he played a pretty significant role in my life too.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
He was sort of like a second dad.
Really?
Yeah, somewhere between a grandfather and a father. Because he sort of saw me as, I'm the first, I was the male, firstborn son.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was sort of like, and I was for my dad. He's very close to my dad. So I think Uncle Mac became much closer to us and to me and to my brother too, but more to me after my parents separated. Yeah, he was
Interesting.
He was yeah. So he sort of filled in that role. Told me, things about my family. Told me things about my dad that my dad wouldn't share with me. So I was too young, and then after he died, So.
So that's actually kind of a different pattern on that side, that because he was very active. I mean, very much of a.
Thank God for him.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
How do you mean that?
Well, I mean, having men around is a very important thing for boys. And I was very lucky to have somebody who was around and who knew my father very well and who was from the same gene pool. As weird as it, how likely is that to happen? Married to my mother's sister and related to my father. It's like he knew both families. So that's been pretty huge.
Really? When did he die?
97, 96, 97. Yeah. But he was around for quite some time. But yeah, he's he's one of the older positive, males on that side, at least. I mean, my sisters haven't really stayed married.
Really?
So yeah. So it's not like I ever got to really connect with my brothers-in-law, with their husbands. So.
And your other aunts, your oldest aunt, she didn't marry, right?
No, she didn't. She never got married.
And your younger.
My younger aunt, Janelle, she was married. She had 2 kids, and they split. They separated. I think my uncle had a drinking problem.
Really?
Yeah, but I think they also had, problems in and of themselves. Yeah, but I don't really know very much about. All I know is that they did split at some point, and they never get remarried. The women never get remarried. It seems it's the damnedest thing.
I want to challenge John's gender narrative that women end up only with each other, with the sisterhood at the center of the family and men disappearing or becoming marginalized. And the question is, what role will John and his brother Brad decide to take in their families? John's father, Robert, seems to have played a more participatory role earlier in the family life before John's birth and the separation. The paternal grandfather, for whom John was named, left the family but maintained his relationships with his daughters until his death, in spite of his wife's injunction that they should cut him off. And then, most interestingly, John's uncle Mac obviously played a major caring role as mentor and friend, as he had in the previous generation for John's father. So let me ask you something. If you could have a conversation with your Uncle Mac and tell him about what you're struggling with, that sort of feeling of not being yourself and pulling away, what would he say?
I don't know. I think he'd probably say, well, what are you afraid of?
But what would he say about the sort of pulling back from intimacy, or that whole sense you seem to be describing, that sort of the sisterhood takes over or something?
I think he'd say that their circumstances don't have to be yours. You have your own life.
In contrast to what you described about your father, who, after they separated, Mac was more present. So it's really like he did it differently. He stayed present even for his nephew's children.
Yeah, you know what, I think that's right. I mean, I guess he sort of recognized, he knew that there just seems to be this way of pushing men out of the picture, that's the way my mom's family is. They've always been that way, but he's managed to do it differently with my aunt Pauline.
He didn't let himself get pushed out.
No, it's actually pretty strong.
Hmm.
So he smoked a lot, and that's what ended up killing him. But he's
Really?
pretty strong. Yeah. So,
but he also sounds like he kept engaging. I mean, he engaged you and your sisters and your brother and
everybody. He was very much there. He was more like an uncle, grandfather, father kind of thing for all of us. And very important for me. And I think he would tell me that, don't let this baby ruin your relationship.
Really? Well, now, the other part of what seems such a strong thread in this is the whole thing of your father's heart attack just before you were born and when he was the same age as you are now. That was a very traumatic thing that, as you're describing it, really shifted your parents' marriage. And kind of was the beginning of it's like at first it pulled your parents together and then it tore them apart. And your mother kind of closed in the way perhaps her family had around Carol being born, in the way that...
I'm kind of afraid something's going to happen.
Are you?
And I'm going to end up doing the same thing.
So I guess that's the question. Because one of the things to me about thinking about all these things in this way is it gives us choices. That even if it happened quite a few times in your family that the sisterhood closed in and the men went to the periphery, there were also examples, I mean, Mac most powerfully, but your father in the early days, I mean, your father was together with you before the heart attack. It sounds like the heart attack really shifted things.
That's true.
So it's like now you don't have to say, oh, well, that's what's going to happen, because you could make something different happen. You could make something like Mac happen.
Yeah, I didn't know. I didn't realize. That's true. It is true, and I think I've been more concerned that there's just no way to avoid it happening.
Hmm.
I thought that I had very little time left to get married, and I luckily found someone who I really care about and got married. And I thought, problems were over.
Hmm.
And having a child was not planned, but it's a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we're not in a position to have one. It's a beautiful thing, but that's been scaring me a great deal.
Really?
And not because I don't think I can take care of a child,
Mm-hmm.
but but I didn't really. I see, or at least I understand a little bit more now why that has been, because that has been on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm going to mess this up, and that I'm going to end up alone.
Hmm.
How does somebody make that jump
Hmm.
to having a child to being alone?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
but at the same time, I think knowing it can help you think proactively, what should I do here?
mhm.
But you're still going to have to make the phone call and not just stay in the bar and avoid it. You know what I mean? It's like you're going to have to actively say, I want to create this instead of that.
Well, basically what I hear you saying is that I have to choose to be Mac, or I have to choose to be like my grandfather at those moments.
Your grandfather's another one, and you're named for him. That's a really interesting thing, because as you were describing it, your grandmother actively pressed her daughters never to see him, and he, in spite of that, stayed connected to them all their lives. That was a remarkable story.
Which is really what's most important anyway,
Yeah. No, really, actually, you have very strong models for doing it a different way from the way you're. But it plays out in the mythology that it sounds like you heard, that sort of you can't count on men, and so the women close in. But actually, there have been very strong male models in your family who didn't do that, in spite of all the pressures. I mean, not to mention the way racism operates and influences all these things and makes it hard.
Yeah, I want to do it differently. I want to do it differently.
Sounds good.
It makes sense.
So what I'm thinking is maybe what to do is just sit with these thoughts a while. But it sounds like you kind of have an idea. And now the question is to try to follow out what you want to do and not let these forces define you. I mean, would that make sense, to just sort of live with it a bit? But what I do want to urge you,
that my family has impacted my life
in that way.
Yeah, I would never have thought.
Family's powerful,
And I can see, it's like one of those things you sort of you've seen it all the time, but you haven't.
Mm.
Anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say, and in your family in particular, there are these people who really overcame odds to do that. I mean, what Mac did to stay connected to your father and to all of you and to the other nieces and nephews. I mean, he was an amazing person. And my sense is that your father was too, in ways that he wasn't always, you didn't get to see him in the best of times, you know?
Yeah.
Because you only knew him after the heart attack, which seemed to have taken some of the life force out of him, you know? And then there's your grandfather. God, I'd love to know what his story really was. You know, maybe someday you'll go down south and check out other people who knew him when. That could be interesting.
Well, it could be. But maybe we can talk about that at some other point too.
Yeah,
I'll tell you a few stories.
yeah. I'd love to hear.
Well, that was a very clear demonstration of using genograms in therapy. I mean, it really set the structure for the whole session. How typical is that of an introductory session that you lead?
Well, in some ways, probably because even though he was initially defensive about it, he moved towards it, and it began to help him make sense of his situation. Perhaps I got more detail and took it further than I might in a first session if somebody continued to be resistant. If they are resistant, I try to move it back to the presenting problem and then take smaller steps to, so let's go back to the original problem, the reason you're here, and then maybe say, did anyone else in your family ever struggle with that? And make more clear connections. In John's case, even though he was initially resistant, he seemed to shift and take it on himself. It made sense to him.
Yeah, well, there were certainly a lot of things that came up throughout the course that certainly seemed to have relevance for the problem that he presented with, which at first he was kind of, seemed mysterious to him. Like, why am I acting this way? It doesn't make any sense. And there were certainly a number of threads you could pull together that at least raise questions about that. So he was resistant, a little guarded, defensive, and it seemed to me that could be fairly common because people are coming in with a problem, whether it's a relationship problem, whether they're depressed or a work problem, and suddenly you're asking them not only about their siblings, their parents, but their grandparents. And I would imagine, folks thinking, well, this isn't really why I came here.
Yeah, in that situation, perhaps it was easier because he himself was puzzled by his behavior, so it made it possible to say, well, do you think, if we look here, if we look there, maybe some of it would make sense. If a person comes in and they have a very actively difficult relationship they're struggling with, and you begin to go as far back as their grandparents.
And they're saying, but my wife's about to leave.
Yeah, right. So what do you care about my grandmother for? Then I would have to slow it down and say, okay, let's talk about you and your wife. And then maybe take it to, can we talk about the family you grew up in? Was there anything similar? And then to your parents, did they ever have any similar conflicts? And really tie it into he's worried his wife might leave him today.
Kind of thing. Because in this case, you clearly kind of made it relevant for him. And it became, he was curious enough that it seemed, somehow this is connected somehow.
I mean, it doesn't always happen. that things begin to make sense. But I must say that more often than you might think, when people have problems that they themselves experience as very surprising, when you look at the genogram, it's curious how often there are hidden things that they've perhaps been reacting to without realizing it. You know, so that part is, in my experience, quite common, actually.
Yeah. I guess I don't know if you've encountered this question or criticism, but is it overly deterministic based on family? I mean, there's so many other forces that influence us, whether there's a bad economy and you're unemployed and you're depressed because of that, or do you have some illness, or a variety of other social factors, and this places so much emphasis on the family.
Well, I absolutely think you have to take the general economic situation and a person's state of physical health into account, and the physical health of other members of the family and so forth. I think all of that is very relevant and does affect people's well-being and sense of where they are. What I would say about the family, as opposed to just focusing on the individual's experience, is that I think we are all so formed by the families that we come from, and that what happens with them matters to us throughout our lives, that not to ask about it seems absurd to me.
Yeah.
So, as a general point of inquiry, I'd say we need to ask about all the aspects of what's going on in a person's environment, but definitely including their families.
Yeah, and it seemed with him, once you explained that to him, because he asked a few times, "What does this have to do with anything?" That you seemed to pique his interest, and when there are these coincidences, that his father had the heart attack when he was 39, and the sisterhood throughout his family, that somehow he'd be excluded. It seemed, at least, not a explanation fully for why he is this way, but at least raises some questions.
Yeah, no.
Now, there were some times, like when he got into his sister and the fact that she had a different father, and initially he didn't really want to go there. And now eventually he did. He said he was comfortable, but his family wasn't comfortable. How often do you run into the things that people just don't want to talk about, and what do you do in those cases?
Very often. And it depends. It depends on the particulars. If I felt I didn't have enough connection yet, I would try to just let it go and work around it till I felt I had more of a sense of trust and could maybe press it again, or maybe make the argument on why it was relevant. In that case, I might have dropped it had he not come round as he did and said, well, it wasn't that he really cared, it was more his mother's secret, and he just kind of had learned the rule not to talk about certain things. If it was a secret that he was feeling the need to keep, maybe I would have been more cautious, because I wouldn't have wanted to press him too hard in the initial session.
Yeah.
I did feel, for example, that he was quite defensive about his father.
Right.
And I didn't want to press hard on that. I felt that he was clearly trying to present the story in a way that didn't really fit with his experience, as if his father had been more present than he was telling me he had been.
What do you make of that?
I don't know, but I found a little tricky in terms of, you know, how much to press, because he is just about to become a father, and so what kind of relationship he had with his father is relevant. But on the other hand, I was always conscious that I'm white, he's African American. That's races, and the barriers of race are huge in general. And even though he was referred by somebody who knew me, who was also African American and obviously had trusted me, he didn't know me personally. So I wondered if he was afraid that I might be stereotyping his father in some way as not having been,
being an absent father,
being absent. And I didn't really feel I knew him well enough to challenge that directly right at that moment. So I wanted to kind of ease around it, but I also felt we had to talk about his father, and I needed to build trust with him in order to have that conversation.
because the fact was his father wasn't around most
That's right.
from the
That's
age of
right.
4 or so when they separated. But
Right.
when you
right.
pointed that out, he
Yeah.
he defended his father and said,
He did.
you know, he was there. He
Was a good
supported
role
me,
model. He worked a lot.
Yeah. Anything looking back at the session you might have done differently? I mean, I
Well-
think any of us, if we looked at one of our sessions,
You bet. That's always true.
that we'd-
You know,
we-
and I
we-
think we can. It's embarrassing, but I also think it's very important for us to think about what might we have done differently.
Yeah.
And initially, when he first told me about his problem of staying out, I wish I had not reacted so strongly, that I sort of said whoa or something. And it was what, 3 minutes into the session or something. I
kind of liked it because it seemed, you know, I know you, it just seemed very genuine. You weren't
but I didn't
sugarcoating
know
it.
him, and it.
You're-
I think it would have been better to have taken a more interested, supportive position about that, just because he might have then felt, well, hey, if she's going to react like this,
You could have
how am I
taken
going
it
to
as a judgment.
exactly?
Yeah.
How am I going to really tell her some of the other things that are going wrong? And the other thing, which is something I'm trying to be more conscious of in general, but that I also regret, is that some of the questioning as I looked over the video was pretty heterosexist. When I asked him, for example, about if his brother had a girlfriend, I wish I'd said it. Did your brother have a partner, and not made the assumption that, you know, because I think that makes it harder for patients to tell you what their experience is if it doesn't fit in with heterosexist norms or whatever norms.
Yeah.
And I think we want to create a context that is as open as possible to allow them to tell us what their experience is.
I know you've been an advocate of using genograms in therapy, and you've trained many students in this. What are some of the challenges in learning how to maybe just the mechanics of doing genograms in the context of a session, or using it throughout the course of therapy? What's hard about learning that?
Well, you need to know the mechanics, but genograms are really not about the mechanics. They're about the underlying history of a person's context, you know? So while students need to learn to do genograms according to the format, because it's a language, so that we can read each other's genograms and know what's being talked about, it needs to be a common language. The harder part is really to get it, that it isn't squares and circles on a page. It's really about who you belong to and what are the patterns in your family that might be influencing how you behave in your current situation.
Let's take those one at a time. First of
Okay.
all, just learning the mechanics of it. What's a good way to learn that, to practice that?
Well, you could do your own genogram. That's obviously a good way because that helps you also notice where there's information that's missing. And if somebody can fill that in for you, then you begin to learn also. I mean, noticing what is unknown about the family history is also important. You know, sometimes you learn all about your mother's family, but nothing about your father's family. And it's like, I wonder why that is. So you have to look at the missing history
So
on the genogram. That's
just
part of it. And
just
then
practicing it.
just practicing doing it.
Okay.
But you can also do it with any biography you read, any novel you read. I mean, I always do the genograms of, you know, any book I read. I'm always doing genograms.
Really?
Always.
Why?
Because it's such an easy way to keep track of who people belong to. I just finished the Steve Jobs things. I was telling you, I had to do his genogram
Uh-huh.
because it was the only way I could remember who he was connected to. It gets complicated.
So that's just the way you see the world.
It's just the way. So I do that for, you know, any book I read. I'm always drawing the genogram in the margin or on a piece of paper.
And then the second part of the question is, you know, then how do you learn to kind of incorporate genograms and use them in the course of therapy over time? How do you do that?
And that's the deeper part,
Yeah.
because that's the part that's really about thinking systemically, thinking about how people are connected and looking for patterns. For that, I think, and this is what Murray Bowen said long ago, your study of your own family is your best way of learning to think systems. So in our training, we always have our students use their own families as a major learning tool.
Makes sense. Like in psychoanalysis, if you want to be a psychoanalyst, you go through psychoanalysis. If you want to be a family therapist, you
have to look at your own family system. Makes sense.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
And so then how do you typically use the genogram throughout the course of therapy? Do you bring it out from time to time? Do you keep filling it in? What do you do?
Well, any session I have, I always use my computer, and I always have three things open. I have notes. I have a genogram always open on my desktop. And I also have a family chronology so that I can keep track of the timeline of events, because the genogram's not very good at tracking that. So anytime
what
something,
is the family chronology?
it just is like a list of, you know, when did they meet? When did they marry? When did he get sick? When did she leave the first time? When did he start drinking? You know.
I see, as opposed to notes, which would cover whatever you're talking about in that session.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the genogram, and often as we're talking about whatever is on the person's mind today, I might say, what does your brother Joe think about that issue? Or have you talked to him about it? And make reference to other members of the families on the family genogram.
So you're continuing to
I'm continuing to look and think about that.
Yeah.
Of, have you discussed this with your sister or your aunt, or who might know about that? You know, somebody can't make sense of something. My father is being so nasty and I can't make sense of it. And, you know, I never really asked you that much about your father's brother. Do you have any contact with him? Might he know something about your father's history? And then, of course, sometimes they'll say, well, why the hell would I want to talk to him? He's as bad as my father. And then you're like, well, okay. Is there any other source? But you also might say, well, maybe the reason is because he might know. and you're struggling with your father, and your father's old, and your father's been sick, and it could be worth your while to talk to Joe or Paul or whoever that is. So I use it as a reference point for helping the person think, how could they learn more about what's going on in their family right now to make better sense of it.
Whether you're working with an individual or you're doing family therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
And in some sessions, it might not come up at all. In other sessions, we might actually spend most of the time talking about, well, if you were gonna, I had a case last week where a 60-year-old woman was sexually abused by a cousin when she was quite young. And she's making a trip now, and she's been thinking of confronting that person's mother, who she was always attached to. And so I took out the genogram and was strategizing with her about what would be, who would be the relevant people, and how might she approach it, and what would she want to say to that aunt, and so forth.
And that conveys to the client like that you know about her system, you know about her family.
And we had conversations a number of months ago about, she initially thought she would never raise the issue in the family, although of course there's never a family gathering that's not a prominent issue for her, that's organizing how she relates to all of them. And a few months ago she said, I can do that. I want to do that before my aunt dies. Wow, that's amazing, because it's also about you feeling free, that you love your aunt, but it's also her business, and it would have been good if you could have told her years ago, but that's great. So now she's going out, I think, this week.
Going back to the case of John Freeman, I had a question about how you ended it. It seemed to kind of ended loose ends. You didn't set up an appointment with him to come back the following week or the following month. You said, well, I think you should think about that a while. Is that typically what you do? Because so many of us are trained to think that our goal of the first session is to get them to come back for a second session.
Okay, well, I do think about it differently. I think on second thought, I would have rather, but the timing was a little bit awkward. I would have rather said, why don't you think about these things we've been talking about, and maybe let's do a follow-up in a couple of months or something. I wanted to give him time to really process it, but then I was thinking a couple of months, that'll be just before the baby's born. Maybe we should wait till after the baby's born. And then I wasn't really sure about that.
So but why
I would leave it relatively open, though, if I want a person to take time to really think about it. And in his case, which that doesn't happen for sure in every first session, it seemed like he got to a place where he was beginning to rethink what was distressing him, and think differently about how he might want to be in the new family with his new baby and with his wife. And I thought he might be okay with that. I don't think people always need to be in therapy to sort through their issues. So I thought it made sense to give him some time to let it to process it. But I had every intention of following it up if he didn't. I mean, I left it open for him to, let me know. But I will do that with people, and then, send them an email and say, how's it going? You want to have another session? But I kind of like to leave it pretty open with people that I thought he was, first of all, quite healthy, and second of all, processing something that could have been a problem. But if he could if he could see his way to managing it differently, he could really have a different life.
So you really have a lot of faith in clients to kind of sort those things out, make that decision. If he wants to be back in touch with you, he can do that.
And I think in this I might be pretty different from many therapists. I think there is an issue of clients becoming too dependent on us, and that they have to tell us every story and every fight they had and every time something went wrong. And that we do better when we give them some things to work on and think about, and the time to process it, and trust that they might really be able to do that, and then let us know when they get stuck, and hopefully, we can then help them go to the next level. So I am a big believer in that, in trusting people to do their business.
Yeah.
And I had a very good feeling about him in terms of that.
Yeah. Well, you really have a nice style, a nice way of connecting with him, and I think that I think that he felt that, and that is a different conception, I think, than we're typically trained with. But it's kind of it's an affirming one for clients.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank you so much for
Thank you.
this conversation and for sharing this delightful case. And I hope that our viewers have found it helpful and will be inspired to consider bringing not only the tool of Genogram, but more importantly, your perspective into their work.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. And I echo Dr. Yalom's sentiments. Hope you found this helpful, clarifying, and motivating. And I look forward to discussing how you're applying this tool, learning how to use it, discussing it in discussion boards and other means throughout the course. Have a great rest of your day.